On the 17th of September, the last Russian troops left Poland, completing their withdrawal nearly 4 years after the end of communism, ironically on the anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, and 2 days later a general election took place, following the fall of the previous government. People's Party leader Waldemar Pawlak had been appointed caretaker PM after the resignation of Jan Olszewski in June 1992, but Pawlak only lasted 33 days before being replaced in turn by Hanna Suchocka, who led the government until the new elections could be organised. The incumbent Democratic Union were defeated in a landslide, but no one opposition party was able to gain a majority, so the Democratic Left Alliance and the People's Party went into coalition, with Waldemar Pawlak being given the post of Prime Minister and presumably hoping to last a bit longer this time around. On the Mobile River in Alabama, a towboat pushing a row of barges made a wrong turn in the fog and struck a bridge over the Big Bayou Canal, an arm of the Mobile. 8 minutes later, the Sunset Limited long-distance train en route from New Orleans to LA arrived at the bridge doing about 70 miles an hour, derailed on the rails buckled by the impact, and the whole bridge collapsed into the bayou, taking with it 3 locomotives, 6 passenger cars, the sleeper and baggage cars. The locomotive's diesel fuel tanks ruptured on impact, causing a fireball and fuel spill. 47 died and 103 were injured, while towboat pilot Willie Odom, presumably aghast at what he'd done, helped pull 17 from the water. He was later found not culpable for the accident, which was caused in the most part because the bridge had been originally designed as a swing bridge, but when the plans had changed, it had never properly been strengthened against lateral movement. That day's Sunset Limited, additionally, had been running half an hour late after some minor repairs, otherwise it would have been long gone when Odom struck the bridge in the first place. This remains, as of 2025, the deadliest accident in Amtrak's history. Following 2 years of United Nations administration and more or less free elections earlier in the year, Cambodia officially regained full independence and adopted a new constitution. The elections had been won by the National United Front for an Independent, Neutral, Peaceful and Cooperative Cambodia, FUNCAMPEC for short, led by Norodom Sihanouk. He'd become King of Cambodia under French rule in 1941 and reigned through to 1955, when he suddenly abdicated as king and went into politics. And during his life he'd seen the country go from a French colony to an independent kingdom to a military republic through the horrors of the Khmer Rouge regime, a war with and subsequent occupation by Vietnam, UN control, and in June he'd been elected as Chief of State. However, the new constitution restored the monarchy, and so after a 38-year interregnum, Sihanouk became King of Cambodia once more at the age of 71. With 2 races to go, the IndyCar circus descended on Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Nigel Mansell and Emerson Fittipaldi both went into the weekend with a chance at the title, and after a wet qualification session it was Mansell on pole and Fittipaldi alongside. Glorious weather on race day though, and a proper championship showdown brought out the crowds. At the start, Mansell was crowded out by both Penske's, and after having not really had a proper go at the tiny triangle/oval circuit, he took a while finding his rhythm and the right line, and dropped behind Boesel as well. The 2 Penske's were both fighting each other, tooth and nail, Tracy apparently not keen to act as Emo's rear gunner, while Mansell dropped further behind. On lap 11 of the 200, Tracy got through, and eventually Mansell started coming back. On lap 37 he passed Fittipaldi for second and set off in pursuit of Tracy, and with him the title. 2 laps later he was past the Canadian and set off in imperious form, lapping Mario Andretti, his teammate, as he went. Behind Mansell, Scott Goodyear was also charging, passing both Penske's and starting to gain on Mansell. After 87 laps, Mansell lapped Fittipaldi, now running 4th, and when Emo dropped another place it was all over, even if Mansell didn't win, but he did, romping home a lap ahead of everyone except Goodyear to become the first man ever to win F1 and IndyCar championships back-to-back. In fact, he would hold both titles simultaneously for another week at least, until the Portuguese Grand Prix 7 days later, when Alain Prost had another chance to secure the 1993 F1 title. Watching Mansell win his title at Nazareth was Michael Andretti, now officially no longer a McLaren driver, the divorce having been announced a few days earlier. As expected, Ron Dennis confirmed that Mika Häkkinen would drive for the remainder of the season. Over at Jordan, another test driver was taking the wheel for the race. Marco Apicella had paid for 1 race, and that's what he'd got, even if it had ended up being one of the shortest Grand Prix debuts in history, second only to Ernst Loef, whose car broke down after just 2 metres at the 1953 German Grand Prix, which was his only entry. Apicella will hope that the 800 metres he managed at Monza isn't the sum total of his F1 career, but at 28 more chances may be hard to come by. Eddie Jordan had lined up his fellow countryman and namesake Eddie Irvine for the last 2 rounds, but with Irvine unavailable for Portugal, test driver Emanuele Naspetti had raised some cash and would fill in, having turned it down after not having had time to prepare for Monza. There were other drivers in Portugal too, not racing but hoping to score a seat for 1994, with footwork in particular looking like a promising avenue despite losing Mugen Power for next year. F3000 Championship leader Olivier Panis, backed by Elf, was in town and due to test a Benetton soon, with Paul Stewart, Gilles de Ferran and Jos Verstappen all spoken about for Jackie Oliver's team, who were also strongly linked with Christian Fittipaldi, apparently in bad odour with Giancarlo Minardi. At Ligier, despite a great season so far, Cyril Derouve had told his drivers that he could only afford to keep one of them on for next year, which had rather chilled relations between the two drivers as, much as they got on, both were also ambitious to keep the sole available seat. On the engine front, both Senna and Hakkinen had driven the McLaren Lamborghini at Silverstone and Pembrey between races, liking the power but finding it mechanically unreliable, and with the uncertainty around Chrysler trying to divest itself of its sports car division, Ron was thought to be leaning more towards Peugeot. Meanwhile, General Motors had sold 25% of the capital of the Ilmor firm to Mercedes, and Sauber would now officially become Sauber Mercedes for 1994, with talk of a full takeover for 95. In IndyCar, meanwhile, Ilmor built engines for much of the field, and the new generation of V8s would also be branded Mercedes-Benz, beginning with the Works Penske team and trickling down for 95. Tyrrell announced that Harvey Postlethwaite would be returning as technical director to oversee the work that Mike Gascoigne and Jean-Claude Migeot were already doing on next year's car, which left a vacancy at Ferrari, who appointed Magneti Marelli man Valerio Bianchi. Gerhard Berger, meanwhile, was finding his elbow much improved and had been testing a new passive suspension at Imola, getting ready for 1994. It was a big weekend for Portugal. On race day, the nation launched its first satellite, the little POSAT-1, on a French Ariane rocket, and Pedro Lamy would become the first Portuguese Formula One driver since 1959 to start his home race. On that occasion, Mario Araujo Cabral qualified 14th of 16, ahead of the two cars of the brand new Team Lotus, driven by rookie Innes Ireland and sophomore Graham Hill. Cabral also finished, unlike the two Loti, albeit last and 6 laps down. The unfortunate Pedro Chavez hadn't stood much of a chance of qualifying here 2 years earlier in the Diane Coloni team, so Pedro Lamy, the latest heir of Hill and Ireland, would be at least hoping to emulate, if not better, Cabral's record. He was at least guaranteed to qualify. The cars went out on Friday, and Lamy performed creditably, ending the day 22nd, but after the session ended, provisional pole sitter Alain Prost called a press conference and announced his retirement from Formula One at the end of the season. He told the assembled journalists that he'd made the decision a month ago but had wanted to wait until he had won the title to announce it, which he hadn't actually done yet but was evidently confident and didn't want it weighing on his mind for the race. The media was stunned, but those who knew Prost less so. He'd been increasingly unhappy over the course of the year with the constant politicking and, at least as far as he saw it, hostility from both the media and the governing body. Nonetheless, at least in front of the public, he was smiling and saying he wanted to go out on a high, that he'd achieved all he wanted to and he didn't want to keep taking risks. Naturally, the airwaves and print pages would be full of tributes over the weeks and months to come, not least from Jean Alesi, who had felt Prost to be one of his true friends in the paddock, just like Nelson Piquet, who'd also retired. All of which went some way to explaining the interview Ron Dennis had given to the Brazilian press a few days earlier, fuming at Ayrton Senna, decrying his disproportionate financial demands and saying he'd had to defer payment of his contract until early 1994 just to make ends meet, and that it was time for McLaren to concentrate on promoting new drivers and put the money into developing the car. It sounded like he was saying Senna would be leaving. What he knew then, but nobody else did, was that Senna had already signed for Williams, but was waiting for Prost to announce his departure. Dennis saw this as a huge betrayal and vented to the press, which in turn meant that by the time they arrived in Estoril, the atmosphere in the garage was distinctly frosty, with Senna refusing to speak to Dennis except through Joe Ramirez and Mansell Odje, and while he did confirm to the press that he would be leaving McLaren, and most assumed that meant he would be going to Williams, nothing was official yet. Despite all that, Senna had still been third to the two Williamses on Friday, with Mika Hakkinen a fantastic fourth in his first competitive session for the team. On Saturday, Hill went out and beat Prost's time, and then Alain, pushing hard, spun out and red-flagged the session early, so Damon had his second pole, but the sensation was behind because Häkkinen had beaten Senna by just under 0.05 of a second to start third. The Ferraris were stricken with understeer as usual, but Alesi still managed to take fifth, beating the two Benettons, which were proving unstable under braking, and 2 seconds off Hill's time. Berger was 8th, and then Warwick and the Brundle brothers made up the top 11. The Saubers were twitchy but decent enough to line up next, with the low tyre suffering the opposite problem to the Ferraris and oversteering wildly, but Lamy nonetheless did well to improve to 18th. A new longer wheelbase Jordan helped Barrichello improve too, while Naspetti only put in 1 lap each day to take a tentative 23rd ahead of the demoralised Fittipaldi and the Lolas, for whom this was widely expected to be their last race. After the session, Senna, still in a foul mood, demanded to know how Häkkinen had gone quicker, and when the buoyant Finn made an ill-judged joke, something along the lines of "bigger balls, I guess," he found himself on the wrong end of Ayrton's temper, pushing Mika against the wall and giving him a piece of his mind. Sunday was sunny with a stiff breeze blowing in off the sea, with 55,000 packing into the stands as they lined up on the grid, and Senna's weekend wasn't improved by having a big off in the morning warm-up, meaning he'd have to take the start in the spare. Off they went for the parade lap, but Damon Hill's car had some difficulty firing, and then when he did get it going, he stalled as everyone else moved, and he was left on the grid with engineers perilously clustered round as the rest headed away, and just like Prost in Hungary, he'd have to start from the back once they finally got moving. So, Mika Häkkinen effectively had a front row start and must have fancied his chances given Prost's patchy record on starts this year. Away they tore, and indeed Prost was slightly tardy off the line, allowing Häkkinen to get his nose ahead and lead a Grand Prix for the first time, crowding Prost over. But as they went into turn 1, seemingly out of nowhere, Jean Alesi came round the outside, passing Senna, Prost and Häkkinen to take the lead from 5th on the grid. Behind him, the two McLarens were jockeying for position, Senna re-establishing himself over his upstart teammate at the Parabolica Interior, turn 6, with Prost 4th, Schumacher 5th, and then a bit of a gap before Patrese in 6th as they went round the first lap. It was the first time a Ferrari had led a race since Prost at Spa in 1991, but it didn't look like it would stay that way for long, as Alesi had Senna climbing all over him. The Ferrari engine was powerful but thirsty, and the cars had to start with much heavier fuel loads, estimated to be about 25 kilos heavier than the McLaren at the start of the race. While it lasted, though, viewers had treated to a fine battle reminiscent of the Frenchman's spirited defence against the Brazilian in his Tyrrell at Phoenix in 1990. Unseen, meanwhile, Hill was motoring, making it up to 14th by lap 5. Alesi still led a little train of Senna, Häkkinen, Prost and Schumacher, then about 5 seconds back there was another Ferrari train, with Berger leading Patrese, Brundle, Wendlinger and Warwick, with Hill overtaking Herbert for 13th, then Leto for 12th on lap 6 to attach himself to the back of that second group. The two Ferraris were both in the same situation, too heavy to get away in the corners, but powerful enough on the straights to keep ahead of their pursuers. The top 5 were running about 2 seconds apart, with Schumacher, who'd switched over to the spare car before the race after finding the setup of his race car wanting, now all over the back of Prost, who seemed happy at this point to watch the McLarens fly out Alesi and drive his usual methodical strategic race. Hill was still flying, setting fastest lap and passing Warwick and Wendlinger in short order to go up to 10th by lap 9. Naspetti was the first casualty of the race, the curse of the number 15 Jordan apparently still holding true as his Hart engine ignited, as the director gave us a brief shot of the other Jordan in 15th, with Pedro Lamy's Lotus hot on its heels. Alesi was still leading, and indeed as his fuel load came down he was starting to pull away from Senna, who in turn was getting away from Häkkinen, while Blundell had passed Berger off screen and was up into 6th, and Hill passed the other Ligier to go up to 9th. Katayama went off shortly afterwards, misjudging an overtake on Comas, Tyrrell's first off of the weekend after an unusually trouble-free qualifying and practice, while Hill had, still off-screen, made his way up past Patrese and Berger and was now 7th. Brundle made an early tyre stop on lap 15, but 18-second stationary put him back out way down in 20th. Prost had now set about trying to pass Häkkinen for 3rd, but still had Schumacher right behind too, as Hill continued setting fastest laps as he bore down on Blundell and the points. With 2 tyre stops expected in this 71-lap race, it was approaching the first window as the leaders came upon the first straggler in the shape of Alboreto, but as they all passed the Lola, Senna's engine suddenly let go and the McLaren pulled over to the side of the road, mathematically confirming what Senna had already conceded, that he wasn't going to win the title this year. At the end of that lap, both Alesi and Häkkinen peeled into the pits from 1st and 2nd places, and both teams pulled exceptional stops to get them back out in the same order, now in 5th and 6th place, as Prost now led Schumacher, with Hill in 3rd, having passed Blundell, now 4th. Häkkinen, having hoped to get past Alesi in the pits and take the lead when the others stopped, was clambering all over the back of the Ferrari as Schumacher made his stop and managed to get back out ahead of the pair of them in 3rd, so Prost now led Hill by 15 seconds, both yet to stop, with Schumacher 5 seconds behind Hill and setting a new fastest lap on his fresh tyres on lap 24. For whatever reason, either the Williams team or their drivers had decided to stop later, and both Alain and Damon stayed out on deteriorating tyres as the rest changed, and Schumacher continued eating into their lead. Before long, the number 5 Benetton was right on Hill's tail as he made his way through traffic. Prost finally stopped on lap 30, a decent stop, but it put him out behind Schumacher, meaning Hill now led, with the German right on his tail as they came up to lap 19th place de Cesaris, and when Hill pitted that lap, Schumacher took the lead in real terms, with pretty much everyone else now having stopped. So on lap 31, just coming up on half distance, the order was Schumacher leading Prost by about 2.5 seconds and pulling away, then Alesi and Häkkinen still running together about 3 seconds behind the Professor, then Hill some 15 seconds behind them in 5th, and Berger back in 6th, about 3 seconds behind Hill. At the end of lap 33, Häkkinen, pushing hard, lost downforce behind Alesi and went wide at the corner, hit the barriers, bounced back onto the track, shedding parts and wheels, and coming to rest against the pit wall. Mika was fine, and you couldn't say he hadn't made an impact in his McLaren debut, but his mistake gave Benetton the opportunity to extend their 2-point lead in the Constructors' Championship. The shattered McLaren was dragged over to rest against the Armco, well off the racing line, so unlikely to be a problem. Meanwhile, a couple of drivers had picked up punctures on the debris from the accident. Berger came in for new rubber, and as he was booting it out of the pit lane, his rear suspension collapsed, spearing him across the track, missing Derek Warwick by inches before coming to rest in the gravel. Barrichello also came in, having properly shredded his left rear, and had to do a very slow lap before being able to change himself. The TV director, having mistaken Patrese for Schumacher, followed the Italian for a while, running 11th after a pit stop, before finding the right Benetton as it made its way through back markers, which had allowed Prost to close up a little, but Alain had no real need to push. With Senna out and Hill still some way behind, second place would do quite nicely to sew up the title for him, and there was no need to blow a gasket, proverbial or literal, chasing the win. Brundle made a second stop from 6th on lap 39, rejoining 10th, and 2 laps later his twin did the same, coming in from 5th and setting off, having only lost 1 place to Wendlinger. Hill was charging again, gaining on 3rd place to Alesi at about 2 seconds a lap, as de Cesaris had a spin on lap 43 and came in for new boots, only to get a bit skew-if in the pits and also have a slow stop. A couple of laps later, Alesi, whose Ferrari was eating its tyres, came in for a second stop, a good one but not good enough to keep him ahead of Hill. Meanwhile, Schumacher was making his way through a big knot of traffic led by Warwick, who was in turn lapping Comas, then Leto, Patrese and Brundle. Michael got past Brundle, and Ricciardo, of course, got smartly out of his way, but Leto, busy lapping Comas himself, hadn't seen the change behind him, and spent some time, as he thought, vigorously defending 8th place against Patrese. Apparently it wasn't just the TV director who was having a problem with this. The real Patrese, meanwhile, was just being lapped by Prost, who'd closed right up thanks to Leto's confusion. An incandescent Schumacher, seeing his second win evaporate as Prost now filled his mirrors, was waving his fist as the Black Sauber spent lap after lap blocking him. Finally, on lap 50, Schumacher got past, and Leto, now seeing a Williams behind him, got out of Prost's way quickly. Schumacher charged off trying to reassert his lead, and Derek Warwick nearly made the same mistake as Leto, but the German wasn't going to give him the opportunity, getting smartly through, followed again by Prost. Lap 52, and as Blundell tried to retake 5th from Wendlinger, the pair collided in turn 3, bouncing the Ligier up in the air and into the gravel and retirement, while the Sauber made a detour into the kitty litter, but was able to continue as an unhappy Blundell trudged off. Leto was called in for a 10-second penalty for blocking Schumacher on the following lap, dropping from 7th to 11th, but all eyes were on the top 2 as Schumacher just couldn't get away from Prost, who was again playing a canny game, putting pressure on the German without risking throwing his car off, trying a banzai move, but not averse to having a go if he saw an opportunity. After all, he may not have needed the win, but I'm sure he wouldn't have minded sealing his 4th title with one. With 10 laps to go, the two were still running nose to tail, and it looked like it was going to be a proper grandstand finish. More bad luck for Johnny Herbert, as the Lotus, oversteering all weekend, got away from him in the last turn, and he wound up in the barriers, a similar accident to his old teammate Häkkinen's, but rather less dramatic. As the director watched that, he picked up Lamy in the other Lotus going past, now in 12th, well, 11th now, and chasing Pierluigi Martini in a top 10 finish, with Leto a little way ahead of them and De Cesaris being lapped as well. 3 corners later, Pedro also lost the rear end and pirouetted gracefully into a wall and out of the race. Just like all the way back in that 1959 race, neither Lotus would see the finish, but while Lamy walked back in undoubtedly disappointed, he'd put in a good shift and underlined his credentials for the future. There was more to come in this incident-packed race too, because Patrese had got it all wrong challenging Warwick for 6th, locked everything up and taken them both off. A furious Derek was clearly in no mood to listen to Patrese's apologies. That put Brundle, who watched the whole thing happen right in front of him, back into 6th, while Hill was going for it again, beating the lap record by a whopping 1.6 seconds with 4 laps to go. But he wasn't able to make much headway on the 8-second gap to his teammate, as Schumacher and Prost weren't going a lot slower themselves, and Prost continued to try and push Schumacher into a mistake or a breakdown without having either of those himself. They started the last lap, Prost still pushing and probing, but Schumacher was unflappable and took the flag for his 2nd career win and Benetton's 1st of the year to really capitalise on McLaren's misfortune. But Alain Prost's 2nd place made him world champion for the 4th time. Hill's fantastic drive from last to 3rd, not enough to keep his admittedly slim hopes alive. Alesi, Wendlinger and Brundle made up the remaining points finishers, Ferrari having a good few races and now moving ahead of Ligier to 4th in the table, best of the rest at least. Juan Manuel Fangio won 5 titles in the 1950s, but since then nobody had managed more than 3. Jack Brabham, Jackie Stewart, Niki Lauda, Nelson Piquet and of course Ayrton Senna were all triple champions, and now Prost had elevated himself above all of them. Clearly, though, the temptation to equal Fangio by staying another year with Williams wasn't enough to persuade him to put up with his unhappiness in F1. Prost had never seemed particularly interested in stats and records anyway, even as he broke all of them. So, as they headed to the podium with Schumacher and Prost both jubilant and Hill pretty happy too, the last 2 races of the year in Japan and Australia, after a 4-week break, would see both titles already settled, but still plenty of competition between Hill, Schumacher and Senna for 2nd place in the drivers' standings, and between Benetton and McLaren for runners-up spot in the constructors.